we have to talk about the temple. That's really that first place where you start, right? Because if you talk about hosting God, surely someone in the crowd is going to say, objection. And I'll be like, hey, what's your objection? And they'll say, God is omnipresent. I learned that in your baptism class. I'm like, yes. So if God is in all places simultaneously all the time, how can anyone be said to host God as if God has a spatial presence when he kind of doesn't? So we're going to talk about that. So let's turn together to 1 Kings chapter 8. 1 Kings chapter 8. And we're going to talk a little bit about the temple. So Solomon, it's 1 Kings 8:22. And in 1 Kings 8:22, Solomon explores exactly this issue. He says, well, how is it possible? You know what? We'll actually start with verse 27. 1 Kings 8:27. He says, how is it possible that a God who is omnipresent can actually have a house? How is it that there is a place where he can really be, and we can use this way of talking about him? So he starts off in these first few verses talking about who God is and how he's a God who keeps covenant, how he makes relationship and then sticks with it. And then he says in verse 27, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? So to kind of spoiler a little bit, when Solomon finishes building the temple and when he finishes welcoming God in, the presence of God falls so heavily, so thickly. The glory of God is revealed there. And like the priests literally have a hard time getting up and doing stuff because the glory of God is so strongly present in the room. So there is this specialness to this place, the temple. And yet, when Solomon first starts talking about it, he says, look, guys, I'm not a dummy. How can God be contained in one place? Heaven and the highest heavens cannot contain him. So when we talk about the presence of God, we're not saying God is he. He's not there. What we're really saying, I think I just turned it off on myself. Hello. Are you still running? Yes? Okay. There's a button. Yo.
What's going on?
All right. I'll trade until. Oh yeah. There we go. So what Solomon is going to point us to is that the question of God being present isn't like he's here or he's not here. What it really is about is God's attention. It's about God's attention. So you'll see this in a second. Behold, how much less this house that I have built. Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his plea, O Lord my God, listening to the cry and to the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open day and night toward this house. So he's saying, look here. The place of which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer that your servant offers toward this place. And listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. And listen in heaven, your dwelling place. And when you hear, forgive. And then he starts with his if a man. If a man sins against his neighbor and is made to take an oath and comes and swears his oath before your altar in this house, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the guilty by bringing his conduct on his own head, and vindicating the righteous by rewarding him according to his righteousness. In other words, be a judge. When your people Israel are defeated before the enemy because they have sinned against you, and if they turn again to you and acknowledge your name and pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them again to the land you gave to their fathers. And then he goes again to, when heaven is shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned, then, hear their prayers. If there is famine in the land and there is blight and pestilence or locust or caterpillar, if their enemies besiege them, and so on, come and hear them. Likewise, verse 41, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake, here in heaven, your dwelling place, do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you. If your people go out to battle against their enemy, if they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin. He lists basically just a whole long list of things that a person might pray for. And he says, if they pray to you here, pay attention and hear them. If they pray to you here, pay attention and hear them. What does it mean to have the presence of God? It doesn't mean that, like, I'm the only one who's got God and nobody else has him. That's not really what they're talking about. What they're talking about is this issue of access, of attention. How many of you have gone out to a meeting with someone in person and they were there, but they were not there? They were there, but every 3 seconds they had to check their cell phone. To the point where eventually you said, hey, is there something up? Are you waiting for something? Is there something that's like on your mind? Because I noticed like you're here, but you're kind of like also not here. That person is physically present, but they are not present. Now on Zoom, it can be like quadruple that. You might be in a Zoom room with someone, and you might theoretically be in a meeting, but their camera is off. And the reason why their camera is off is because if you were to look, what they're actually doing is like some completely other thing off on the side. This is why like online classrooms don't really work that way, right? Anyone who went to school during 2020, during the COVID era, knows that lots of people who were theoretically in class were not really in class. This is what it means to have the presence of God. If I'm in the same room as you, you're in my presence, technically, but we all know what technically means. But if I am looking at you and making eye contact, I am present with you. On the other hand, if I am in the room with you and making eye contact with you, and I am so close to you that our noses are almost touching, I am really present with you. And watch out, because this is probably a K-drama, right? So there are different degrees of presence like this. And when we talk about hosting God's presence, what we are talking about is both being present with him and being aware of his attention being on us. Being aware of God's attention being on us. Frankly, if we were more aware of God's attention being on us, we would be simultaneously a lot less afraid about things, and at the same time, a lot more wary of our own conduct. A lot more wary of our own conduct. Back in the day, before smartphones, if you were on the internet, it meant that you were on a desktop. And the thing about desktops is they have big old monitors. Speaking of monitors, did I go down again? Oh, it's this, isn't it? Yes, that's exactly what it is. Okay, I'm smart. So, if you were using a desktop in a public space, I promise you that you were writing your paper. You were actually making progress on doing your work if you were using a laptop in a public space, because the people around you could see what was on your screen. And there was this sense of accountability that just came from being there in public. Now, I don't know if it still works that way, because if you go into a library, you see all these kids like playing Roblox on the library computers. So I guess they don't have the same kind of shame that people had back in the day, where they're like, LOL, what are you doing? But nowadays, on the smartphone, we have this false sense of privacy. We have this sense that I can just navigate wherever I want and look at whatever I want, and nobody can see it. And I can just go wherever and watch whatever. where the presence of God is, we have the fear of God is. We have an awareness that whatever we do, he is always watching. He's always close there. He sees what we're doing. I encourage people all the time to have an ongoing, running conversation with God. When I was kind of coming up in the faith, when I was BP junior aged, the big thing that everyone was always trying to sell us on was do morning time with God. It's a good idea, do morning time with God. But for me, it was never really obtainable because the time constraints were really there. And I'm a morning person, okay? So if I, as a morning person, was like, I don't know if I have the time in the morning to set aside this big chunk of time to just like talk to God, then I suspect that some of you that are not morning people are like, that's an impossible goal. And the reason I would say this is, I had this idea in my mind that praying to God was like calling him on the phone. Hey, what's up? It's so good to hear from you. And like if you meet someone who is in a relationship for the first time, or just when a relationship has just started, one of the things you might hear is very long phone calls, right? You'll hear the person answer the phone, you'll be like, hey. And then, they're on the phone with like 3 hours with this girl. And you're like, okay, I know, I can see where this is going. And if you expect your prayer life to be like that, I would love to see how your schedule is arranged because you have so much better time management skills than I do. It's very difficult to schedule out really long time blocks to just chill out with God. But the way that I think will help us the most is if we think about talking to God, being present with God, being less like a long phone call and more like a text conversation. More like a text conversation. As we are going through our day, as we are going point to point, event to event, we are talking to him and we are staying present with him. We're never allowing that little idle button to come on that says, I'm away from the office right now. But whenever the Lord texts us, we always text him right back. And whenever we text him, we glance down and we see, hey, has the Lord texted me back yet? So instead of seeing the random guy come up to my car while I'm getting on 678 and he's trying to sell me churros, and I'm just like, if this hasn't happened to you, it's probably because you don't drive. It happens all the time. Instead of saying, oh man, I really hope that guy does okay, and I'm thinking about all these different political things, and I'm thinking about the human impact of this, and I'm saying, how will this guy get help? And instead of just thinking all these things, I'm actually going to talk about them in real time with God. God, I have no idea what this guy's name is. I don't want him to just be like roadside guy. I want him to have like real personhood to me. I want to care about what happens to him. Lord, could you take care of this guy? Is there a way that real progress can be made on these issues? I know that there are so many feelings about this, but I know that you have your own feelings, Lord, and help us. And then just listen and see what he has to say. And what you will find is, if you allow yourself to be present with God, he will become more and more present with you. There is this deep human fear that somehow our relationships will not be equal. That I really like her, but what if she doesn't like me? There's this deep fear that if I go next to this person and I sit next to them on purpose at lunch, that they'll be like, but what if they think I'm needy? What if they back off? What if they run away? And one of the promises that we have with God, it's very explicit in the book of James, for instance, is that if we draw near to God, he will draw near to you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. If you choose to send messages God's way, and it says, Lord, I don't know what to think about this situation, he'll draw near to you. He'll talk to you. He'll share with you. He'll start hitting you with opinions. And I trust you, God has some really spicy hot takes on the things that are happening around you. You'll say things to him, and he'll say things back to you that are just utterly unexpected. I remember way back in the day meeting a guy who at that time I did not recognize as a prophet. I just heard him as a chapel speaker back in college. And my first instinct seeing this guy was, what a goofy looking guy. Like literally, that was my first thought looking at him. And my first thought hearing his voice, hearing him speak is, what a high-pitched voice that guy has. Okay? He did not exactly command my attention with first glance. And immediately the Holy Spirit said to me, yo, you better take that guy seriously. He knows me. And I was like, oh, okay then. And later on, over the course of the semester, I came to learn that this particular guy, his name was Jim Bailey. He's probably still around out there. He was the kind of guy where if he talked to you, you never knew how much he knew. You'd be like, I'm really sad. And then all of a sudden, he would just come out with all this stuff like he already knew all the reasons why you were sad because the Lord had already told him. So he was just so gifted. And at first glance, I was just like, this guy looks so awkward. If you draw near to God, God will draw near to you. If you make up your mind that you're going to chat with him, God will chat with you. Instead of trying to say, hey, I'm going to just block out this huge chunk of time somewhere in my day to spend all this time with God, break it up. The reason why Muslims pray 5 times a day is because Muhammad saw Christians doing it first. I'm serious about that. There were specific hours of prayer where people would just stop what they were doing and pray. And this idea of just breaking up your prayer into these little chunks of time over your day, grab the 5 minutes where you can. I had to take a bathroom break. I had to go outside and get some fresh air. Just whatever it takes to get there, we bring him into our lives. We keep the conversation running. And what we'll find as we begin to host God's presence in this way is that we will be changed. So in order to create the sense of hospitality with someone, if you're going to open your house to someone, what's that look like? How do you do that? Well, part of that is you bring them in and you make them comfortable. You bring them in and you make them comfortable. One thing you want to do if you have someone over your house is you're probably going to clean your house. If you have no shame whatsoever, maybe you just say, yeah, come on by. My house is a huge train wreck, but come on in. But much more probably, if you know that you are hosting guests, you're going to put significant time into organizing your space. You're going to make sure that you have places for them to sit. You're going to make sure that you have a table in your house that fits everyone, or at least mostly fits everyone. And this sense of getting the space ready is part of how you will demonstrate love to your guest. When most of us think about sin, we have been taught to largely think of sin in terms of the rules. Even if you didn't really grow up in church and nobody talked to you about penal substitutionary atonement, you probably went to school. And schoolrooms have rules. They say, if you do this bad thing, this will be the bad result that you get. And there is a real sense in which sin kind of is that. But sin is also a relational offense. It's also a way in which, if you talk this way, your friends won't want to play with you. If you sin against God, it's really hard to host him. If I have people over my house for dinner, if I'm going to show them hospitality, one of my first questions is going to have to be, do you have any food restrictions? Do you have any food restrictions? And that might be allergies. That might be cultural. That might be whatever. It might be, hey, I'm keeping a particular kind of diet and I have to eat these specific things. And if you have food restrictions, the number one way for me to show you that I don't actually care about you is for me to simply ignore those things. Right? If I'm like, oh yeah, come on over to my house, have some fun. But oh, by the way, you can't actually eat any of the things I prepared. That's one of the ways that you tell a guest, I don't really care about you. The reason we Christians are so concerned about sin, the reason why sin matters so much to us, why we talk about it so often, why repentance is such a big deal, is not because we're big-time sticklers for the rules. We're not like the kids who care about keeping every rule because it's a rule, and we tell on everyone if they're breaking the rules. The reason why we care so much about sin is because sin affects the way that we relate to God. If you want to have God in your life, you need to know there are certain things he's just not cool with. He will not be there with those things around, like adultery or murder, right? And this is why we go through such a hard time purifying our lives and caring about these things. Because we know that if I want God in my life, he can be more present or less present depending on how I am living around him. So we purify ourselves, not necessarily because it is, we are just like the rules are a really big deal, but because we care so deeply about knowing God who deeply cares about them. We have this desire to come close to him. Now, in the time that King Solomon built the temple, God's presence on earth, the place where you knew that he would be, was extremely spatial. It was extremely spatial. If you said, how do I get into God's presence? You could use Google Maps and get there. You said, I know that if I go to Solomon's temple, I will find the presence of God. And because people knew that, you could have things like the Queen of Sheba traveling to see Solomon. And she goes to see his wisdom, she goes to see the presence of God. But one of the interesting things you start seeing as the Bible moves forward, and especially as you cross from the Old Testament into the New Testament, God starts to do something special, unusual, and powerful. In places like 1 Peter, he starts talking about the church, capital C, as if we are the temple. He says, and all of you are a temple made without human hands. The foundation of it is the prophets and the apostles, and all of us are living stones out of which this temple is made. So if you want to find the presence of God, if you want to find the place where God is paying really close attention, where his eyes are wide open, where he's looking right at you, find me a place where there's a little group of Christians praying. And I promise you, the spotlight of heaven is right there. It's right there, wherever we are. And that's not a spatial thing. So if you guys are meeting here in church and we are in the sanctuary and we're all, hallelujah, praise the Lord together, then God's like, oh, and he's paying attention to us. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone in the room is paying attention, although we are more likely to keep God's attention if we are. But as long as the Lord is paying attention and he's watching us and we know he's there, meeting's going to be a good meeting. But suppose we are not here in Manahole. Suppose that we're somewhere wildly else. There are a bunch of you together at your high school, and you have 4 Christians in a little basement classroom. Is the presence of God there? Yes, because wherever believers are assembled together, there is God's temple. He is there in our midst. He's paying attention. Not only that, but we see other places in the New Testament, especially in Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman in John 4. she asks him a question about where God's presence was chosen to dwell. Because Jews believed that it was the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and Samaritans believed that it was their rival Temple Mount on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. And Jesus takes her question and says, hey, look, lady, he goes, the day is coming and is here where people will no longer say, well, worship on this mountain or that mountain. But God's worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And elsewhere in the same book, he talks about whoever believes in me, rivers of living water will flow out from him, the way that living water was supposed to flow out from the temple. And that means that you are a temple. You are a temple. Whenever you pray, the presence of God is there with you. God's spotlight is on you. He comes and he dwells in you. And whenever people who are just like how the Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon and find out about the Lord from him there, the people who are around you, wherever you go, should be able to recognize that the Lord is within you, inside you, speaking to you, empowering you, strengthening you. Biblically speaking, wherever the presence of God is, that place becomes paradise. Healing happens there. The tree of life is there. The river of life is there. There is joy there. And what you'll find is, if you determine that you're going to live this out and say, I'm not just going to have in my theology that I am the place where God's presence dwells, but if you say, I'm going to choose to live there, to be this, then you will find that your life will gain these paradise elements in it. There will be times where you are, I'm not saying that your life will be like, gee, I have no problems anymore. Generally, it's quite the opposite. In fact, the more we have God's presence, the more we seem to experience the pain and the difficulty that will bring us closer to him. But what you will have is that you will have this joy that springs up from the inside, which all of your circumstances cannot fully suppress. So, when we host God's presence, we make space for him. We clean the house for him because we know that having him is worth the effort. We go through the trouble of preparing. How do we do that? What does that look like? If you come into my house, I'm going to offer you something to eat. I'm going to offer you something to drink. And in doing that, you'd say, well, what can I offer God that is something that will actually please him? He is the guy who has everything, right? It's the danger of having it being your friend's birthday and you're trying to shop for them, but you realize that like you're kind of normal and your friend is really rich. You're like, anything I buy might be something they already have. And if it's not something they already have, how do I know it's something they would want? Because if they want it, they probably have it. God is like that, like times 10, right? God has everything. So what do we give him? Well, in Romans 12, it talks about offering up our bodies as living sacrifices, which is our reasonable act of worship. When we worship the Lord, we are giving to him something of value, something that he looks at and he says, that's awesome. And in reality, it doesn't need to be something super fancy. When we host the presence of God, it does not mean that we have to then, there was a definite trend when I was a young man for Christians to want to be Christian in public in an extremely striking and obvious way. I think I wore a hat in high school that said, Jesus Christ, the force with no dark side, which is exactly as cringe as it sounds like. And I had like every Christian T-shirt known to humankind. And there was this idea that if you wanted to be Christian, you had to be like obnoxiously loud in public. And you had to make your clothing choices and like everything you did had to be about Jesus. And frankly, it did not draw all men unto Jesus. If anything, it just kind of announced to everyone, like, be careful around me. Now, what it does mean to offer to God this acceptable service of worship, what it means to worship him in a way that gives him something, is that both by our actions and by our deliberate use of time, that we put him first. We choose to sacrifice to him. We give him something. There was a great Matt Redman song that said, "Our time, which is precious, we pour out like oil upon your feet." And when we come and we worship the Lord together, what we're trying to do is not just like Christian karaoke. What we're trying to do when we come together is offer the Lord this part of ourselves. We are saying, we take the lyrics and we actually enact them. We take our faith and we put them into motion. As if you, like, there are words that you speak where you're like half serious, and words that you speak where you're like pretty serious, and there are words that you speak that you're deadly serious, right? Like if someone says to you, "Hey, are you coming later?" And you're like, "Well, I'm an introvert. I don't really want to come, but I don't really want to say so." I'll be like, "Okay, we'll see about it." Those are words half spoken. You're not really going to see about it. You already know you're not going, right? Well, this is why when someone says to you, "I'll pray about it," you should probably respond to them, "Are you really going to pray about it? Tell me when you do, okay?" Like, because a lot of times I'll pray about it means I want to say no, but I'm too shy to say so. There are words that are like mostly spoken, and then there are words that are like dead serious. If I say to you, "Do you take this woman to have and to hold, in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, from this day forward, till death do you part?" If you say, "I'll pray about it," or "I'll think about it," then I'll be like, "Why'd you even ask me to officiate this wedding," right? Because if you start asking those words, you know those words are deadly serious. You say those words, you have defined the line between what is acceptable behavior and what is adultery, right? Things that you could have done a couple days ago are things you can no longer do. So when we sing worship songs, we need to be very careful about this. Be careful about what lyrics you will sing and you won't sing, right? Because when we are offering God a sacrifice of praise, we are telling him things like, "You are my one thing," right? We're not saying this is literally how things are, but we're saying this is how I want things to be. Lord, if you take away my car, you are my one thing. Lord, if I break up with my girlfriend, you are my one thing. Lord, if all of my college admissions fail and I have to go to my backup school, you are my one thing, right? Like, as you start to sing a song, you're like, you have to think about it before you sing that. When we are hosting the presence of God, we offer him something of value. We offer him something of value. There's a great passage in the Old Testament where King David is offered a field on which his son will one day build the temple. We know it today as a Temple Mount, right? Probably the single most contested piece of real estate in the world. And the guy who owns it says, "Tell you what, just like, you don't even have to pay me, just I'll give it to you." And King David says, "No, it doesn't work like that. I will not offer to the Lord a sacrifice that costs me nothing." How do we host God's presence? We offer him a sacrifice that means something. We offer him a sacrifice that means something. So, what we are trying to do here is not merely being a nice, friendly church where people will know your name and where we will have good programs that add value to your life, where you will learn how to get a good job and hold it, where you will learn how to prepare for retirement and then retire well. And churches can at times fall into patterns like this, particularly if we're being really honest, immigrant churches. Immigrant folks have lots of needs. Immigrant churches like to meet those needs, and those are real things, and we should care about serving people. But the first mission of the church is not that. The first mission of the church is not to have nice organizations and nice structures. The first purpose of the church is to say, when you come in here, you know God is in our midst. We build a place where people can experience God, and that if they are not yet in the place where they can encounter God for themselves, that they could meet him here where other people care about it. Now, this being the case, this has to affect our church culture. If we're serious about hosting God's presence, our church culture has to change because of all the things we've been talking about. When you have a person in your house, you need to be really there with them. You don't invite someone to come to you as a guest and then go and work from home the whole time that they're there with you and you ignore them, right? You invite someone over your house, you don't feed them with food they can't eat. You invite someone over your house, you clean up so that they feel like this is an ordered space that's been prepared for them. We as a church want to host God's presence. When we're in the room on Sundays, this is something we have to constantly check our hearts for. And the questions that we will keep asking will just depend on who we are. As a pastor, okay, I'm going to speak. We always preach to ourselves first, so I'll ID some of my problems here. As a pastor, you are very sensitive, almost hypersensitive to who is in the room. You come in, worship starts, your first instinct is to look around and count people and say, who's here on time, who's here late? Do we have enough people to really be able to sing and have that everyone is singing, so you have that power in the room? If you stand up during worship and you lift your hands, there's this little instinctive is anyone else lifting their hands? Am I that one person who's standing out? If you also happen to be a pastor who has kids in the room with you, you are, which is my experience a lot of the time these days, you're are my kids behaving? Are they distracting anyone? Do I need to grab them? Are they running out of the room? Are they going to go on stage? You have to think about these things, right? But there's a balance. On the one hand, if you're doing something, do it with all your heart. It's part of how we serve God, right? Part of hosting guests is not just how you talk to them, but also the act of cooking. If you cook for your guests, it is an act of love. But love might mean the ratio of ginger to garlic, okay? Love can be very logistical at times. And the way that love is expressed in the church will be very logistical at times. But sometimes it also means that we just have to refocus our hearts. And we have to look real closely. There are times where I have to give up thinking about, are the Jets winning right now? They never are. But you just have to give up on those thoughts. And you have to say, no, that's not where I am right now. Where I am right now is hosting God's presence. And you just have to dissociate those other things from your mind. And you have to be with the guest. Be with the guest. There are times where we come together at church, and our first instinct is, my friends are here. And especially if you're this is going to sound funny, but especially if you're a really introverted kind of person who's I spend my whole week alone, and this is where my friends are. like there's a real temptation to just go all like happy puppy and just want to talk to everybody. If you were that kid who had a really hard time paying attention in class and listening to what the teacher was saying because you kept talking to the person sitting next to you, then there are times in church where you're going to have to reorient your heart. And you're going to say, Lord, I love these holy people who you've put around me, but my first responsibility is to be with the guest. My first responsibility is to host you, to look for you. This is our value. He is the guest. Cue the background music from Beauty and the Beast, right? We want the Lord to be our guest. We want him to be welcome here. We want him to feel cared for here. We want him to know that this is a place where he can come and do whatever he wants, and we'll roll out the red carpet for him. Whatever else happens in our service, it can go wrong. But offending the guest, that can never go wrong. Now, let you in on a secret. Draw near to God, he will draw near to you. You have somebody over your house, odds are pretty good. If they can do it, sooner or later they'll invite you over their house. Yeah? You are never going to be more hospitable than God. God is 1,000 times the host you are, and far more than 1,000. When we come together and we say, Lord, be present here in our midst, he will. When we say, Lord, have this, my honest, authentic praise, he'll take it. But if you think you're going to outfeed God, you will not. When we come together in church, when we assemble together in love, when we worship him, when we say, Lord, be welcome in my home, the Lord will come and say to us, okay, but you come and be welcome in my home. And if you say, Lord, I'm going to worship you and give you this sacrifice, he will say, wait till you see my sacrifice. Because when we come together at church, it is not us who are feeding God. You can't feed God. God is not, you could feed, Jesus eats. We know that Jesus eats. But he is not dependent on us for life. But instead, what we will find is, once we have opened our hearts for him, once we have come and been with him, once we have drawn our attention away from all the mundane things that call us away from the guest, and we have come to him and made eye contact and listened to him and shared with him, what we will find is he will call us to his dinner table. And he will say, you come and receive from me. Come and obtain life. Come and obtain healing. Come and obtain power. Come and obtain joy. And what he will give us, his sacrifice, just as our sacrifice to God is our very self, his sacrifice, which we receive, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, is his very self. So as we eat the bread, let's choose to be in this kind of relationship with God. Let's choose to offer him our space. Let's choose to offer him our hearts. And let's receive from him his hospitality. Let's draw near to him and choose to sit at his table. And if you're down for this, if you say, hey, sounds good to me, I'll do the cleaning, I'll put the time aside, I'll make room in my attention, then I invite you to come and receive from the table of the Lord. Let's come and welcome his hospitality.